I do just want to quickly acknowledge Yoon Sun, who very, very graciously, at very late notice, accepted our invitation request to come give the Chinese perspective. Anyone who's familiar with Yoon's work knows that she is hardly a backup. She is, she might technically be in this case, but she is as expert as they come. So thank you again, Yoon, for filling in like that.
So, thanks everyone for who's staying on for this last panel, and welcome to anyone who's newly joined this day's discussion here while we discuss the international implications of the South Korean debate over nuclearization. My name is Mark Fitzpatrick. I'm an associate fellow at the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies, and I'm a board member of the Korea Economic Institute. And for purposes of this panel, it's relevant that I wrote a book a few years ago about Asia's latent nuclear powers, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And I'm delighted to be chairing this panel with four experts who will explore different aspects of the international implications. I'm going to introduce them right before each of them speaks, so not all at once, so that you don't forget who they are. So I'll start with Heather Williams, who is director of the project on nuclear issues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, otherwise known as CSIS. She's been a fellow at MIT, at Harvard Kennedy School, and a bunch of other places. Most importantly, we were fellow expats in London for several years, where we got to know each other well. She taught defense studies at King's College there, and she was a research fellow at Chatham House. Heather has published a paper on the KEI website, and it's jointly with everyone else. She did it together with Jessica Link, who was a program coordinator and research assistant at CSIS. Jessica won't be speaking on the panel. She's going to be cheering on in the audience back here. Like the title of their paper, Heather will address the global reverberations of nuclear South Korea. Heather, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for a very kind introduction. You make a great hype man. Thank you as well to Clint and Andy for the invitation to be here. As Mark said, I'm speaking somewhat on behalf of my co-author, Jess Link, from our paper, but I'm also going to make a few remarks more on my own from my work on the NPT. What I'm going to talk about today will be a focus on the implications of a nuclear South Korea for the nuclear order and the nuclear regime. I'll start off by focusing on the current state of play of the nuclear regime and its health. Quick snapshot, it's not good. Then I'll say a bit about the three scenarios for what a nuclear South Korea might look like based on our paper. And then I'll talk a bit about the implications and policy recommendations. But to give you the bottom line up front, I agree with some of the earlier speakers that fears of a nuclear South Korea are overblown because of the constraining power of the NPT. And the NPT has come up a few times. I'm going to dive really deep into that. I simply do not see South Korea as being the second country to withdraw from the NPT. I do agree with Dr. Hecker that such a step would be a significant blow to the wider regime. Despite its current challenges, the NPT remains an important foundation for the nuclear order, and from my experience working on NPT issues and working with the South Koreans on these issues, South Korea is a real leader in the NPT, so this would just be a really significant shift. So first, in terms of background on the state of play of the NPT and the wider nuclear regime. So the NPT community is incredibly polarized right now. It's been really stymied, really stuck, to be perfectly frank. I think there's three main polarizations going on. The first is somewhat obvious between nuclear possessors and nuclear non-possessors. Most of the nuclear non-possessors are frustrated, disappointed with the lack of progress towards Article 6 of the NPT and nuclear disarmament. The second polarization is within the P5, the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states within the NPT. The P5 is process within the NPT has essentially stopped functioning. It's really stuck for pretty obvious geopolitical reasons. And then the third polarization is actually within the non-nuclear weapon states themselves. And this polarization is between states that are under a quote-unquote nuclear umbrella, that rely on extended nuclear deterrence, are involved in nuclear sharing agreements. And then the other group of non-nuclear possessor states who are actively working to undermine extended nuclear deterrence. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But in general, the NPT remains polarized. Every 5 years, as most people probably know, the NPT holds a review conference to assess the status of the treaty. The last meeting was in August. The meeting resulted in did not result in a consensus document, and this was largely because of Russia refusing to agree to certain language on Ukraine and Zaporizhia. However, there are some trends within the RevCon and NPT that I think are useful for this group. And that is, I outlined these different polarizations. There's also really active efforts for bridge building to bring together those different communities. A few of them that I'll flag. At the review conference, one of the main initiatives was around risk reduction efforts. This was largely focused in the NATO context, but I actually am going to talk a bit more about how I think this might be an opportunity for the US and its allies in Asia. Another growing trend is a new initiative, actually, by the UK and Norway on irreversible nuclear disarmament. And this is really only a year old. It's pretty fresh. Again, from my experience, South Korea has been very active in this. South Korean MFA has attended the meetings. They're putting a lot of ideas into the process. Another bridge building effort is led by the State Department. It's called CEND, Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament. And South Korea co-chairs one of the working groups on emerging technologies. So that's all to say, South Korea is really invested in this regime. Other pressures weighing on the nuclear regime right now, the biggest one one of the biggest ones I want to point to is the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. They held their first meeting of states parties in June. This treaty had a lot of momentum behind it. And it lost a bit of that around Ukraine, but that movement is still very, very influential. And there are a lot of voices within the TPNW community that are calling for states to withdraw from the NPT because of lack of progress towards disarmament. Other pressures include China has become much more aggressive within the NPT context. This review conference, it literally was a different China team in how aggressive and wolf warrior they went. And then the other trend has been, as I mentioned, this growing pressure on nuclear sharing. And we see, and nuclear sharing, but also extended deterrence. And that pressure is coming from the non-nuclear weapon states, it's coming from Russia, it's coming from China. And a lot of these actors have said, we are going after nuclear sharing, we are going after extended deterrence. And that will be one of their priorities for this review cycle. Other pressures obviously include Russia's violation of various arms control efforts and suspension of participation in New START. This is all to say the state of play of the nuclear order is not good. The NPT is fragile at this moment. The regime itself, all the various different components all seem to be in a weakening state. So this brings us to potential scenarios for a South Korea to pursue its own nuclear deterrent. And I don't mean to be flippant, but I do actually want to point out the timing just couldn't be worse in this sense. So in our paper, we outlined 3 different scenarios. A previous speaker had 2 of ours, so I'm going to go through these really quickly. Scenario 1 is increased nuclear latency. This would be part of an intentional strategy to create a nuclear option, this would not be part of an intentional strategy to create a nuclear weapons option. And it isn't that likely to trigger international sanctions or cost, but it could create a foundation to leverage in the future. And I know a few people have indicated they think this is already the current state of play. This scenario would have the least impact on the NPT, but it will really depend on political trends and atmospherics within the NPT itself. Scenario 2 is the one that's a bit different from the earlier presentations. This would be a hedging strategy in which there would be more intentionality behind a South Korean nuclear program. The intent would be the primary distinction from the earlier one, as it would include deliberate steps towards creating and maintaining a nuclear option. A hedging strategy for South Korea would raise questions about its commitment to the NPT. It would probably raise a lot of questions about double standards, depending on how the U.S. goes on this. If the U.S. says, oh, South Korea has the right to pursue this strategy, oh, but Iran, you don't. That is a diplomatic nightmare, I assume. So it would also raise questions about South Korea's participation in many of the initiatives that I outlined before. And then scenario 3 would be a fully developed and deployed nuclear capability. In this case, South Korea would cross the threshold of nuclear acquisition by developing and deploying a nuclear weapon with corresponding delivery systems. One thing to flag here, because it hasn't come up, would be the question of whether or not South Korea would need to test, and if this would mean that they would have to withdraw from the CTBT. So again, potential really negative consequences on the global regime. This would make South Korea the second country to withdraw from the NPT in order to pursue its independent capability. And so it really could have contradictory effects, not just to US policy, but to the NPT and to the nuclear regime itself. So those are our scenarios, and I'll now turn to implications and some recommendations. So first off, if South Korea were to withdraw from the NPT, this would just be a massive game change for the NPT. I literally cannot overstate how significant this would be, particularly because of the state of the NPT right now. I can envision this leading to a proliferation cascade and to other withdrawals from the NPT. I think I differ from a lot of people in this room. I do not think Japan would be one of those first countries to go, but I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion. Fundamentally, this could lead to the collapse of the NPT. That is how significant I think that would be at this moment in time. So what can be done to try to avoid all this? Two kind of areas I want to focus on. The first would be cooperation between the US and South Korea as part of the alliance to strengthen the nuclear order, but also to strengthen the rules-based international order more broadly. China, Russia, South Korea, or North Korea, various other actors, when they withdraw or when they suspend participation in arms control treaties, this is literally an assault on the rules-based international order. It is an assault on the nuclear order as we know it. It is intended to increase ambiguity and uncertainty. It is really essential that the US and its closest allies, including South Korea, uphold that order, that they are in lockstep on what that looks like. Some ways that they could cooperate to achieve this: continuing with the CE&D initiative. I mentioned before that in the NATO context, there is a big momentum building around strategic risk reduction, and I'm happy to talk about this more. I would be really keen to see a similar effort in East Asia among the US and its Asian allies. And then another concept is the US, UK, and to some extent France are advancing a concept of nuclear responsibility. This has become a major talking point in the NPT context. The US, the P3 wrote a paper that was submitted to the NPT on this issue. I think it'd be great if South Korea got involved in this and talked about what nuclear responsibility looks like from Seoul's perspective. And then kind of final area that I want to focus on for implications and recommendations does have to do with, for lack of a better phrase, calling out bad behavior. To be frank, I was pretty shocked by the lack of an international response to Russia's suspension of New START. And I think that this is an area where the US, working with its allies, should really do more to say we aren't just strengthening the existing order, we also want to increase and strengthen the norm against bad behavior. And so encouraging more states, particularly non-nuclear weapon states, to call out in unilateral statements what Russia has done. This is not, to be clear, this is not a dig at Seoul or South Korea in any way. But I have raised this point with many other non-nuclear weapon states, and their response was, well, we coordinated a statement within the Conference on Disarmament. Isn't that enough? No, the answer is no. There needs to really be a much more concerted effort with these unilateral statements that I'm talking about. It can be a tweet. The Austrians issued a tweet that was actually really good, and I thought was quite powerful. Those types of measures will, I think, go a long way to strengthening those norms and also to encouraging other non-nuclear weapon states and states in the region to do the same. And I think South Korea is a leader in the region and a leader in nuclear responsibility and can play an important role in doing that. So just to wrap up, whether or not South Korea pursues nuclear weapons, this is not only a test of US credibility, which we've talked about a lot, it is also a test of the reputational strength of the NPT and the nuclear regime itself. And I think among the allies, there is a shared interest and a shared need to see that that does not fail. So two real questions for discussion that I'm really eager to hear what people think is, do you think that South Korea would withdraw from the NPT and be the second to North Korea in doing so? And under what conditions would that happen? And then the follow-on question is South Korea willing to suffer the diplomatic, political, and legal consequences of such a move on the international stage? And with that, I will stop there.
I'm sorry, Heather, we're supposed to ask you questions. I thought that's the way this worked.
I used to be a professor. This is what you do.
Thank you very much. No, that was, if anybody didn't get the key point there, it's that South Korea really has been a non-proliferation leader. They've been wearing the white hat, and a little bit different from some of what we heard in the historical setting in the first panel, but over the years and building bridges and so forth. And boy, would they have to change the color of their hat if they were to take a different posture.
You said it better than I did. Thank you.
Thanks. So next up is Terrence Matsuo. He's a freelance writer and a non-resident fellow here at KEI. I first met Terrence when he was the assistant editor and senior research analyst at the Nelson Report under the tutelage of our great friend Chris Nelson. Terrence has a Master of Public Policy degree from Pepperdine University. He works on American foreign policy vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific with a focus on Korea and Japan. And Terrence will talk about Japan's response to a prospective nuclear South Korea. Over to you, Terrence.
Great. Thanks for that great introduction. And I also want to say thank you to KEI for inviting me on this project. I'm very honored to sit here among such distinguished colleagues. So Japan's government has been a strong supporter of non-proliferation efforts. Japan has signed on to most of the arms control treaties governing nuclear weapons, including the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, the 1970 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which we've just covered very deeply, and the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which has not yet entered into force yet. And so there are also some domestic Japanese legal laws and norms that have supported this kind of non-proliferation stance. I'm sure we all know about Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which calls for a pacifist foreign and defense policy by Japan. There's also the 1955 Atomic Energy Basic Act, which confines nuclear research to peaceful purposes. And there's also the 3 non-nuclear principles, which are not codified into law, but are kind of a guiding statement of Japanese government policy. They were introduced in 1967 in remarks to the Diet by then Prime Minister Eisaku Sato, who said that Japan would not produce, possess, or permit the introduction of nuclear weapons in Japanese territory. At the same time, Japanese officials have sort of wavered in this opposition to nuclear weapons. As early as 1957, then Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi suggested that nuclear weapons were permissible under Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, so long as they were considered small nuclear weapons. Even Prime Minister Sato himself, who articulated the 3 non-nuclear principles, noted that they were not codified into law and suggested that Japan needed nuclear weapons to deter China. And so this kind of ambivalent approach to nuclear weapons has continued under the Kishida government. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, his family is from Hiroshima City and his constituency is still in that city. And so he's intimately familiar with the horrors of atomic warfare. He became the first Japanese leader to attend the NPT Review Conference last year. And he's also announced that he will host members of the G7 this year in Hiroshima City to support efforts to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons. At the same time, Japan has still not yet signed on to the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons and has echoed previous governments that the participation of nuclear weapon states is essential for the treaty to work. So Japan's government has not said a whole lot about this current debate in South Korea on nuclear weapons. I think this is for 2 primary reasons. The first is that far more attention has been placed on addressing the historical issues, which I think this audience is intimately familiar with. I think that issue has much more urgency and thus priority for the Japanese government. And I think also that this kind of quietness on the part of the Japanese government kind of indicates that Japan is a mature society and recognizes that this is still kind of a domestic debate that South Korean public needs to have. Having said that, I do think that if South Korea chose to pursue nuclear weapons, I think there would be a very strong reaction from the Japanese side. I would expect to see economic sanctions limiting trade and commerce between Japan and Korea, as well as a pullback from the kind of military and security cooperation that we've seen kind of revive in the last few years. I would also expect to see a very strong diplomatic reaction, perhaps including things like recalling the Japanese ambassador to Tokyo for consultations with the government, as well as Japan using international fora like the UN Security Council or the International Atomic Energy Agency to kind of isolate South Korea for its actions. The reason that I kind of believe this is because this is basically what Japanese government did in response to India's development of a nuclear weapon. In 1998, over the course of 2 days, India conducted 5 nuclear tests that were called Pokhran-2 after its location in the desert. And Japan was one of the states that really criticized India for this action. The Japanese government recalled the ambassador to India. They froze all Japanese aid grants to India, as well as called for a review of all international loans made to India by international organizations. They also used venues like the then G8, as well as the UN Security Council to kind of criticize India for this, for its actions. And I think specific to Korea, I think another important development would be a severe breakdown in the bilateral relationship. Under the previous government, I'm told that there was a sense amongst Japanese policymakers that Korea was kind of moving the goalposts when it came to international agreements that it had signed on to. Things like the 2015 Comfort Women deal, as well as the 1965 Normalization Treaty. They were criticized by some in Korea as being illegitimate. And that really fueled a sense of Korea fatigue amongst Japanese policymakers, and also encouraged a kind of perception on the Japanese side that South Korea was aligning more with states like the North and China. And so I think if South Korea chose to pursue nuclear weapons and withdraw from the NPT and basically reverse course on all these non-proliferation efforts, I think Japan would see these as kind of a betrayal of the so-called shared values that Japan and South Korea share. And it is possible that bilateral relations could recover. I mean, we've seen that with Japan and India. Both are very strong partners, both participants in the Quad and things like that. But bilateral relations between South Korea and Japan are difficult even in the best of times, both for diplomatic reasons as well as domestic politics reasons. And so, I don't think it's a good idea for South Korea to willingly create new sources of friction with a partner and a neighbor that it already has such a complicated relationship with. And so in conclusion, I would say that policymakers need to make decisions that advance their national interests, as they do here in Washington, in Seoul, and Tokyo. But I would say that South Korea should not consider Japan's rather reticence on this issue. That's not a signal of indifference or even quiet acceptance of this program. If South Korea chose to go nuclear, I think it would have severe short-term consequences. In the long term, maybe things could recover, but I think you would have just a more fraught bilateral relationship between South Korea and Japan when that relationship is already so complicated and difficult. And so that kind of concludes my remarks, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terrence. You stressed that Japan has also been a non-proliferation white hat holder, and you also, I think, very usefully brought up the historical precedents of Japan's response to India nuclearization, which is the only comparable historical situation here. And your description of how Japan would react to Korean nuclearization, the one aspect that we need to explore more is how dependent is that on the U.S. Reaction. And to give us some analysis of the U.S. reaction, we'll turn next to Caroline Milne, who is a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis, which, by the way, is where Heather got her start. I forgot to mention that. Caroline is a principal analyst on the Nuclear Policy and Strategy team at IDA, where her work helps inform the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Air Force, combatant commands, and other national security agencies. So she's pretty important. She worked at RAND earlier and got impressive degrees here and there, but the most important part of Caroline's resume is that she was an intern at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, where her boss was Mark Fitzpatrick. So I always think of her as Caroline Riley. She was great. She was one of those interns where I searched her out, not vice versa. So please address the implications for the U.S. ROK alliance.
Thanks, boss. So thanks so much for KEI for the opportunity to speak today. It's awesome to be here, and I think this is a tremendously focused day of research. My research question was specifically, if the ROK progresses towards a nuclear weapons capability, how might this impact alliance dynamics? So 2 disclaimers. The first is that these views are all my own and do not reflect that of the Institute for Defense Analyses or the DoD. And then secondly, everything I'm about to say is rife with potential measurement bias. As Heather explained, the initial non-proliferation crisis is extremely certain, but robust predictions beyond that, including on the alliance itself, are really hard to predict. First, you have an independent variable of rock proliferation that could take many forms. Then you also have a dependent variable of alliance dynamics that can really change depending on what level you're looking at and what time step you're looking at. So, for example, are we looking right after the potential proliferation is known, months later, years later? At what level of government are we talking about? Head of state, OSD policy, USFK commander, or all of that combined across issue areas? This alliance, as has been attested to by earlier presenters, is a fairly sprawling institution. And so there's a lot of dynamics to impact by this potential choice. So all of that being said, the first big sub-question for this exploratory research task was, would the U.S. government decide to sort of support this choice or seek to arrest or reverse it? And here I argue that it would be very difficult for Washington to accept this. It would, a future where Seoul has decided to move forward with a nuclear weapons capability is just as likely to feature a U.S. that is trying to persuade Seoul to change its mind. And I see this as based on an assessment of 2 trends that make the risk of broader instability really too difficult to accept for Washington. The first would be the introduction of multiple new types of drivers for nuclear escalation. So you have kind of two nuclear actors on the peninsula who are messaging one another, bring in China, bring in the U.S. There's also the period of time where Seoul will be building up its capability that might make preemption more of a risk for Pyongyang. So there are all sorts of drivers that are already complicated enough in the nuclear deterrence space that would be made more pernicious by the introduction of a rock nuclear program. Secondly, I think the second trend that would be very risky for the U.S. to accept would be the encouragement or activation of the nuclear ambitions of other allies and partners. As it has been argued already today, what we're seeing today with the South Koreans, you could arguably make the same case for other states in the region. And then a third trend that Heather has recently raised is this issue of a diplomatic nightmare / double standard and working through that. So there are a whole lot of things that I think would discourage the U.S. from acquiescing to a sole decision to proceed with a nuclear program. Now, how would the U.S. go about trying to persuade a change in mindset? This would be a very, very tough job. It would be a task of compellence, which most scholars, or many of you here know, is a costlier and more difficult job than the coercive diplomatic cousin of deterrence. You're trying to change the status quo versus maintain it, and therefore it's much. the steps you're going to have to take to bring about the end state that you desire are going to likely, in theory, be more costly than if you were seeking to maintain the status quo. What this means in the context of this hypothetical world we're looking at is that a return to the status quo ante is going to be a non-starter for Seoul. I also think this suggests that, as Paul mentioned earlier, cost imposition is not going to be a helpful lever for the U.S. to use. I think carrots are going to be more important than sticks in this situation, especially at a time when, with the rise of China, if you look at the NDS and its focus on allies and partners in bringing about a response to the China threat, I think that trend makes carrots a much more important thing to turn to than sticks. The second sub-question for this piece of research, what's the most appropriate intervention that the U.S. Could turn to seek to try to reverse Seoul's decision? Now, at least for now, my sort of survey of the alliance space is that a nuclear solution would be needed to address a nuclear problem, and therefore the intervention would likely have to be rooted in the U.S. nuclear triad. Now, this is not like logically decided, right? It shouldn't necessarily have to be this way, and this kind of echoes my question before about other levers of deterrence, because this alliance has broadened so far beyond nuclear issues that it's almost disappointing that the solution has to be nuclear, because cooperation has expanded into so many other areas that I think you would think, in theory, deterrence in the nuclear space could be bolstered by levers of deterrence in other domains: space, electronic warfare, advanced conventional. So there's an integrated deterrence question here, an implementation of integrated deterrence question that I think this analysis begs for a response to. So tabling that for now, if we think about what's this sort of nuclear intervention, I often think about hardware versus software, assets in the region versus consultative mechanisms that Paul described. The hardware part of extended deterrence in the Asia Pacific has dwindled in recent years since the PNI agreements in the early 1990s, while the latter has strengthened over the last 15 years. Still, I think we find ourselves in a situation where hardware seems to be what is looked to solve this problem. And so I'm thinking about hard power indicators of nuclear resolve. So if that's sort of the logic, then a negotiation of some sort of burden sharing agreement might offer returns to both hardware and software in this space. That said, there are clear and known risks and costs to this sort of decision, which both of the panelists here have already spoken to. So that's sort of where my analysis ends, and now I'm going to move into a few takeaways from doing that research. The first is that this research question is an unfortunate reflection of the downward trend in the security environment, and as in tandem with a downward trend in the confidence the U.S. and its allies and partners have in the tools that they have to address that environment. So that's point number one. Point number two is, if we are in this situation where the ROC has decided to proceed with the nuclear weapons program, the future that is likely to manifest out of all of the alternatives is likely to be the least bad option. None of the options or none of the futures are necessarily great. They all have their costs and their risks associated with them. And so I think the choice is really going to be, how can we minimize the damage to the alliance, to the broader global non-proliferation regime, and beyond. Third, as the U.S. considers its response to this situation, I would argue it would seek to adhere to two principles that have guided its choices about nuclear policy for years: commitment to non-proliferation, and sort of these things have always been in tension, but also a commitment to extended deterrence and assurance. So I think it would seek to adhere to both of those principles as best it could, but the form and function that the solution would ultimately take will likely feature compromises on both of those principles. Again, if we're in this space, point number 4 is that it seems right now, given for example, the polling results, that nuclear hardware seems to have a core role in how we think about dealing with this potential issue. This is probably not where we thought we were headed in the 90s when we pulled all the assets out of the theater. And it also runs, as I mentioned earlier, counter to the expansion of the alliance in terms of its the many types of activities and engagement that the U.S. and ROC engage over. So why this is the case and does it need to change, I think, are really two big questions that that this community can seek to address over the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for a highly nuanced and really interesting presentation that raises so many questions for me. I hope we have time to address them. And I hope this doesn't sound condescending, but I will never think of you as an intern again. You are first class. Rounding out our panel is Yoon Soon, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, where she is co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program. Her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. South Korea falls into the neighboring countries category there. She has been at Brookings and at the International Crisis Group. And at short notice, as was mentioned, she graciously agreed to step in to provide her expert commentary on Chinese perspectives on the South Korean nuclear armament debate. So, Yoon Soon, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to Clinton for the invitation. What an honor to be the backup for Professor Han Hua, who has very large shoes to fill. Just before I start, are we following Chatham House rules today, or are we on the record? Or
we're on the record.
We're on the record. Okay, all right, good to know. Thank you. Just so you know, just so that I know, because I checked the recording is for KEI only, but maybe not. That's okay. So I have had about 3 days to prepare this. So I think I did my best to scope what the Chinese policy wonks have been discussing, what they have been saying, and what is the general temperament or the mood about this issue. And there are some similarities to what my co-panelists have mentioned, but I think there are also major distinctions. And I think the distinction primarily originated from this overwhelming influence in China's perception of pretty much anything today, which is U.S.-China great power competition. And I think that confers a strong sense of cynicism and also skepticism coming to South Korea nuclearization, as well as this talking point that NPT is still important. Because I think the Chinese are still agonizing over AUKUS, and they do agree that AUKUS does not violate the wording, the specifics of NPT, but they do say that it violates the spirit and principles of NPT. So I think that's why the sense of cynicism and skepticism are quite striking in a Chinese assessment of this issue. So I'll cover 4 issues. The first one is the Chinese incredulity. That if you ask the Chinese South Korea analysts that, hey, do you believe that South Korea is going nuclear? Yeah, maybe, but no, not really. I think there's a very high level of disbelief that this is eventually going to, maybe not eventually, but this is going to happen in the near future. So the question is not only a political one. Of course, they are aware of the political, economic, diplomatic costs that South Korea will have to pay, and they do believe it has certain level of deterrence effect over Seoul's decision-making. But I think they also question from a technical point of view that yes, South Korea has spent fuel, but to develop weapon-grade uranium, are they there? How long it will take? Do they have the infrastructure not only to develop the nuclear material, but also, now South Korea has pretty advanced missile capability, but in terms of other related infrastructure, is South Korea there? How long does it take for South Korea to get there? And one point that's raised by a foreign ministry affiliated analyst is that even if President Yoon starts today, he cannot finish within his term. So what does that mean for his decision making and also for his future successor, and whether this policy is going to be sustainable? So I think there are those skepticisms in China about this. And there is also the question about, well, South Korea is so small, where are they going to have the nuclear test? But so that's another question that may or may not require that nuclear test. So at least for now, it does not seem to be that many Chinese policy specialists on the Korean Peninsula are convinced of this imminent possibility. Although none of them denies that this could happen, they just see a lot of obstacles, not only political, economic, diplomatic, but also technical associated with it. And I think this is a reasonable response from the Chinese policy community because they have more imminent concerns about South Korea, other than nuclearization, which is President Yoon's policy shifts from President Moon, right? And they are watching that South Korea improving relations with Japan. They are looking at this nightmare scenario that the rapprochement between Japan and South Korea, which is something that China had counted on to prevent the emergence of what they see as a Northeast Asia NATO led by the United States, and seeing that it's going away and this could happen. And they are concerned about, well, they know that President Yoon has adopted a completely different policy from his predecessor in terms of China, relationship with China and relationship with the United States. And they are, so far, they would say that, well, we have done our best, we have tried our best to hold our frustration and to play as nice as possible. Look, President Xi met with President Yoon in Bali for 15 minutes, but they met. But for them, I think this the unpredictability of President Yoon's policy, not just on nuclear issues, but more broadly about North Korea, about China, about the regional security architecture, that's a much higher level of concern an imminent concern for China. And that brings to the third issue, which is where the cynicism comes in. That I think for some of the senior Chinese strategists on the Korean Peninsula, they see this discussion about South Korea going nuclear as a strategy, as a means to an end, but not the end itself. And that's what was discussed as, well, a nuclear question needs a nuclear solution. And that's where the speculation that, well, maybe South Korea knows that it cannot go nuclear. Maybe its more realistic goal is to inflate its demand, and in the end, it will get something else. Still better than getting nothing, right? And this could be the nuclear sharing. This could be the enhanced interoperability between U.S. force, USFK, and South Korean forces. It could be the deeper integration between the two militaries. And at the minimum, it will exert more pressure on United States, on China, on Japan, on North Korea, on Russia, on everyone to change their behavior. So I think for the Chinese assessment, this point is particularly salient, that maybe South Korea is not aiming for nuclear weapons. They're aiming for something else. And I think this idea that, well, maybe nuclear solution, what U.S. can do hardware-wise or software-wise is the answer, I think that will sort of substantiate what the Chinese were speculating. In the event that South Korea does go nuclear, even before South Korea goes nuclear, South Korea talks about going nuclear, a go-to strategy for China, and I think it does reflect their true concern and true intention, is to blame the United States. That first and foremost, how can you let this happen? This is your ally. Hold off your ally and manage your ally. And if you cannot, then what kind of global leader are you? So I think this will become a very big vulnerability in terms of the U.S.-China relations, because the Chinese will be attacking U.S. in every single way possible if this is going to happen. And I think the Chinese will raise the issue of AUKUS because it does see it as a precedent of a U.S. double standard. I think they are going to hold the U.S. at an impossible level of accountability on this particular issue. And compared to that, I would say the Chinese concern about NPT, of course, they're concerned about NPT's crisis and NPT's credibility. But I think for them to use this issue or to attack U.S. for this issue is going to be a much higher priority. In the event that South Korea does go nuclear, what is the end game? I don't think the Chinese have talked a lot about this. But the sense is that, well, yeah, if it happens, of course, it's bad. But look at India, Pakistan. Eventually, the world renormalized the relationship with India. and people, well, the world moved on. So I don't think the Chinese will go there as their first priority, as their first go to talking point. But if it does happen, then I think for the Chinese, they will try to coordinate a collective international response through United Nations. This is not going to be a unilateral reaction by China, right? And this is not going to be just unilateral response by the region. This is a global issue. I think the Chinese will bring this to UN Security Council, and they will seek UN Security Council action, because for them, this is not a China problem. This is a world problem. But at the same time, I think before it happens, like the discussion we're having today, we're trying to speculate what China will do unilaterally. I think the Chinese are very unlikely to announce or hint or even imply any unilateral or preemptive measures that it would adopt in the event of South Korea goes nuclear, because I think the Chinese will fear of being exploited. And the U.S. could point China to South Korea and say, look, China is a bad guy. If you do this, China will punish you. So I don't think the Chinese will see that as a feasible strategy, especially at this point when they're trying to maintain a stable relationship with the Yun administration. And last but not least, the U.S. response will have a significant impact over China. If U.S. tries to be lenient, which it doesn't sound like U.S. will be, if that is the case, then I think the Chinese attack on the U.S. alliance system, on the credibility issue, will escalate to the next level compared to what the Chinese have said about AUKUS. But on the other hand, if U.S. is willing to pursue let's say hypothetically, the same level of sanction it pursued against India in 1998, then I think that will be something that the Chinese will prefer to see. But the implied message is that if U.S. does pursue that level of sanctions, that's inevitably going to do damage to the U.S. ROK alliance, right? Well, I guess it was to be asked that will the alliance still be there if South Korea has nuclear weapons? So for the Chinese, it raises a whole different list of questions. What's going to happen to the alliance? What's going to happen to the U.S. Military commitment, military presence on the Korean Peninsula? So that's going to represent a major opportunity of change on the Korean Peninsula, and that's, I suspect that the Chinese will make full use of that opportunity. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow, that's another sophisticated, highly nuanced presentation. If you can do that in just 3 days' notice, I think you should always give yourself just 3 days to do anything. Come out brilliantly. Yeah. The point at the end that you made, would the alliance still be there if the ROK acquired nuclear weapons, is one that I'd like other panelists to address in their answers to the questions that I'll be posing, and I'm going to pose one to each of them in order, and then maybe another round of that, and we'll interact with members of the audience as well. So starting off, here we go. Heather, going through these scenarios, and you talked about a lot of the measures the United States might take, kind of to punish, but to compel or coerce. What about what measures the United States might take in order to avoid scenarios 2 and 3 in particular?
Thank you for the question. I think Caroline covered some of it, so I'll just tease out, I think, one point in particular you made about integrated deterrence, because hearing the first panel this morning, particularly Paul's talk, I don't think you used the phrase integrated deterrence, but I was like, this is integrated deterrence, but we still don't quite know what it means, particularly in an extended deterrence context. So I think I'll pick that apart as a way that I think the U.S. might be able to offer more assurances to Seoul. And to do that, I think it's useful. I still go back to the 3 C's of deterrence and what it means for extended deterrence. So capability, credibility, communication. And so on the capability side, I think that it's a hardware issue, a lot of which Caroline covered, but I also think there's a capability issue in terms of the sustainability and health of the wider U.S. nuclear enterprise. Support and funding for that just continuously keeps getting pushed back, and as Paul and others have repeatedly told me, our U.S.'s allies watch that. Like, they're very aware. Like ceiling tiles are falling down in some labs. So the capability issue, it's not just about hardware being forward deployed, it's also just about the health of the wider U.S. nuclear enterprise. I'll jump to communication as the other piece, and I think this is more of a software issue, but improving the consultation process. One thing that I hear from allies both in Europe and in Asia is that in the past, sometimes a U.S. delegation will show up and say, there's our policy, you've been consulted, you're welcome. And that isn't really a consultation. And so improving the consultation process, and as I understand, the Biden administration has made real efforts, particularly following the sole purpose declaratory policy debate. But then that leaves credibility, and I actually think this is the biggest, and to be clear, all three of these are very much interwoven, but I actually think the credibility challenge might be the biggest, and that is because of U.S. domestic politics. That if I were a U.S. ally right now, I'd say all these assurances are really great. Thank you for improving your consultation process. Thank you for trying to increase investment in the nuclear enterprise and all these things. How do we know that that's not going to change in almost exactly, like in 2 years? And I don't have a good answer for that. And so I think that that's a piece that there isn't a lot that we can do about other than, so that's where I actually think focusing on the capability and the communication side really is the best in time investment on the U.S.'s part to try to reassure South Korea to avoid the hedging and the breakout scenarios. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Heather. Terrence, you mentioned that at times historically, Japan has wavered a bit in its commitment to nonproliferation, or at least has talked about it a little bit. Let me say this. Before lunch, or during lunch, a couple of us were talking kind of flippantly about how many minutes it would take Japan to go nuclear if Korea did. And sorry, that was very flippant. But could we expect? Do you think we could expect Japan to react that way if South Korea, actually did produce nuclear weapons?
Right. Thank you for the question. I'm not a technical person, so I'll leave that to your great book on Amazon and the other specialists. But what I would say is that yes, Japan does have the technical capabilities, right? We've heard about how Japan has the nuclear fuel and the technological capabilities to do that, et cetera. But I don't think that the political will is there quite yet. I didn't include it in my paper because it was a little out of scope, but there was a small survey of Japanese and Korean university students done in 2020, I believe. And when asked, should your country take up nuclear weapons, something like 84% of Japanese respondents, the Japanese university students, said no, we shouldn't do that. In comparison, only about 40% of Korean students said that should not happen. And so what this tells me is that, this commitment to pacifism and this opposition to nuclear weapons, I think is very strong. Even 7 decades after the war and a few decades less from the, I think it's the Happy Dragon accident where Japanese fishermen were exposed to nuclear fallout from an American test. Even though all of these decades have passed and people literally have grown up in a world not having actually experienced these nuclear events, there's still a strong opposition. And so I understand the point on the technical aspect that yes, Japan has this ability, but I'm not sure that Japan has the will to do so.
Well, I guess, Terrence, it's not so much the technical, it's the emotional response. If this neighbor across the sea with whom they've had so many historical issues and there's this lingering animosity we're all well aware of, if they develop nuclear weapons, would that change the emotional attitudes that you've described so well about the anti-nuclear attitudes? Would that be strong enough to change that attitude? And I'm guessing you're going to say no, but maybe not.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't want to get into the historical issues, not just because they're out of scope, but because that's so complicated. But I don't think Japan views South Korea, the Republic of Korea, as a threat. there was a book published in, I think, 2012 by the Asia Pacific Initiative Foundation in Japan that identified a unified Korea with North Korean nuclear weapons as kind of the worst possible scenario for Japan. But I think that has a lot of assumptions built into it, and that presumes that a united Korea with nuclear weapons, or just a Korea with nuclear weapons for today's discussion, is one that is revisionist, is hostile to its neighbors, and is threatening in that sense. And so, that's why I brought in the point of India, right? India does not have nuclear weapons directed at Japan. India has acted otherwise fairly responsibly in terms of nuclear issues and security efforts. And so I'm not certain that Japan would feel extremely threatened by nuclear weapons in Korea.
Okay, thanks very much, Terrence. Yoon, you talked to, I think, well described the incredulity with which Chinese, look at the debate in South Korea. They don't think it's going to happen. But then you also mentioned the potential for nuclear sharing as one option that the United States and South Korea conceivably could pursue, and others have suggested this might be one answer. Would Chinese see that kind of nuclear sharing? And there's variations of what nuclear sharing could be. I mean, you mentioned the possibility of a Northeast Asia NATO. That very well could involve some kind of nuclear sharing. So do they think this is a real possibility, and how would they react to it?
Yeah, that issue is actually is pretty well elaborated in the Chinese policy discourse as well, and I do think that they see that as a bigger possibility compared to the nuclearization of South Korea. But I think at this point, they still see that likelihood is relatively low. So it's possible, but the probability is not extremely high. It's higher than South Korea going nuclear. But like one elaboration in China has called into question that, well, first off, there needs to be domestic consensus in South Korea. Secondly, there needs to be domestic consensus in the United States. And thirdly, US and South Korea also need to develop a consensus on what will be shared, how and when. So I think that's what the Chinese see as a process, and it's not going to be a speedy process for any of these consensus to develop. And there's also the question as well, what kind of nuclear sharing? Of course, any kind of nuclear sharing between US and South Korea will be seen as bad news by China, right? But the details still matter. Yeah. Is it a NATO-like or NATO type of nuclear sharing that US will have tactical nuclear weapons in the member states, but the member states military will be trained to use them or deliver them with the approval from US and UK? Or it will be, I think President Yoon mentioned at least once that he does not want technical nuclear weapons on the South Korean soil. Then maybe this is a Chinese misquote, but I read it in the Chinese deliberation. So what does that look like? I think those questions are still quite unclear in terms of the arrangement, but overall it's higher probability than South Korean nuclear armament, but still a big issue for China moving down the road.
Thanks very much, Yoon. Heather, I wanted to come back to you. Were you the one who said who said a nuclear response is needed? I'm sorry, Caroline. Dr. Milman. A nuclear response is needed to a nuclear problem. Can you elaborate? Did you mean nuclear sharing, or what did you have in mind there?
I meant by the term solution, I did mean, in this case, an instance of nuclear hardware being deployed to the region, or some nuclear asset being in the region. Now, that was based off of my observations over the past 10 to 15 years of how we have had a number of consultative mechanisms in place, which I term hardware, and yet we still seem to find ourselves in a situation where confidence in the tools that the Alliance has to address the threat environment is not high. So by a process of inference, I looked to hardware in this particular piece of analysis. the nuclear piece of that I find to be really interesting because of the proliferation of other types of potential solutions that could be used to address this deterrence issue. Space cooperation, electronic warfare. Sorry, I've mentioned these a few times, but cooperation in cyber. These are other tools that presumably should be more at the forefront of addressing issues of coercive diplomacy, and yet the debate seems to keep coming back to the nuclear type of solution.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to ask the audience in a minute here if anybody's got any great questions. Has anybody got any lukewarm questions? Paul, you got a great question, I'll bet.
Lukewarm.
So I'd like to ask whoever on the panel might be able to speak to this about the point that Dr. Milne just made. I see one challenge with non-nuclear capabilities achieving strategic deterrence is the ability to prove its effects. How are we able to demonstrate that? You know, whether it's space or cyber, to the point where we can raise confidence that you can, in fact, achieve nuclear deterrence via non-nuclear means.
Well, I guess I would turn that back to Paul first and ask how, so when you talk about effect of nuclear, are you talking about 1945?
So this is where I think in the South Korean military, it's very poorly communicated when we say that our advanced missile capability has the same power as, say, low-yield nuclear weapons. Right? I do believe that what they mean by that is that it is able to achieve the same military objective that we seek via low-yield nuclear, which is to be able to penetrate bunkers and threaten regime survival. Right? So I don't necessarily believe that the metric by which we need to prove non-nuclear capability is a 1945 type destructive power, but it is to demonstrate we could penetrate facilities in the north to the point where it would threaten and cause pause in the Kim Jong-un regime.
Understand. So I think that the first question I would back up and ask, you know, what are the objectives you're trying to achieve through the effect? So I think establishing that first is key. Then I think there are a number of ways you can go about demonstrating that a certain means could have a particular end. I think models are a good way to do that. I think war games and TTXs are increasingly, that draw on models are increasingly a strong way to go about doing that, especially if they're done with partners. So I think there are ways to, and I guess this makes sense because I'm an analyst. Of course, I'm like, you can analyze it. But I do think there are ways short of conflict and in conflict demonstration that you can use to demonstrate the effect.
Okay, let's broaden this out a little bit beyond the Paul-Caroline debate. In the front row here, sir.
Is there any chance South Korea might adopt the Israeli approach and build a bomb in secret and never admit whether they had it?
You want to go ahead? I have an
No.
answer. The reason there's no chance is because South Korea is such a vibrant society. The press is so free to the point of being irresponsible. And there's no way that anything can be kept secret in South Korea. It becomes news immediately. You know, and back in the 1970s when Park Chung-hee was pursuing it in secret, the United States found out then when they didn't have press freedom. So I think the idea that they could do it in secret today without anybody knowing, I mean, it's just not possible. Sorry, Jeff, first of all here. You're right here. You've got a mic right next to you.
Great panel. Quick question, Carol. I'll direct you to start with.
You said a nuclear solution to a nuclear problem, hardware. Might the AUKUS model play here, where you're sort of a little bit pregnant here? In other words, we're not providing you a nuclear capability. And we talked in the last panel, of course, that South Korea enjoys the infrastructure right now to produce everything but the active materials. So making that transition would be ostensibly fairly easy. And for the other panel members, obviously interested how China, Japan might react to that type of arrangement. And Heather, for you, of course, what that might mean for the NPT regime if we start playing that model more broadly.
Okay, Caroline, you go first, and then Yoon, and then Terrence.
So I would say yes, I think it offers a really interesting model that you could potentially apply to other allies in the region. Where I think you run into issues is that there are a number of different types of alliance mechanisms going on in the Asia Pacific. And I think it's confusing, or they don't necessarily all add up to a direct pull into the extended deterrence fold. So I think that it could potentially be useful how all of these overlap in a way that is additive and productive from a deterrence point of view remains the question.
I think it depends on specifically what arrangement is being sought after here. Like if it's AUKUS like arrangement, does that mean that the U.S. will collaborate to provide South Korea with nuclear power submarines? And if that is the case, I think for the Chinese, well, there is already a precedent, so they're unlikely they can stop it. But I think they can pose the question that what is the South Korean intention for having it? Is it about North Korea, or is it about China, or is it about something that's bigger? And if there is no good explanation as for how this arrangement is not going to affect China's national security, I think the Chinese will retaliate, and they will take measures, like not necessarily like what we saw in 2016, but there is a pretty long list of punitive measures that China can seek.
Your question about like the latent nuclear capability on the part of South Korea and the response by Japan, actually that type of strategy is something that some scholars have discussed about Japan, where Japan, as we kind of discussed, develops the capability to go nuclear, but waves it around and says, oh, but we're such great people that we won't do it. So if South Korea chose to do that kind of a strategy, I don't think Japan would be particularly upset, mostly because that's what they do too. And I'm not exactly sure what you were asking about the AUKUS-style arrangement, but what I would say is that, the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, they have talked a lot about that trilateral cooperation, particularly under the UN government. And so I think that is another way to kind of reassure Japan of South Korea's intentions, of that kind of cooperation of we're all on the same page, we all know what we're doing, we're not going to be surprised like that. And I would also just kind of point out that that's another reason why South Korea should not necessarily consider nuclear weapons, is just that there are conventional capabilities available to it, and that has a quality all of its own.
So potential implications of an AUKUS-like agreement on the NPT, it really depends how this AUKUS agreement gets through the NPT, which is still very much TBD. At the review conference week 2, this was China's #1 talking point, and for about 4 days, every one of us became an expert in nuclear propulsion, and that was all that the NPT talked about. It was a great 4 days, let me tell you. But in seriousness, China's points did get some traction. And there are quite a few countries that are now very interested in nuclear propulsion and its compliance with the NPT and where it fits in. So I think that this is very much that this is still unfolding. One thing I would just flag, though, is that the other side of the debate within the NPT context around AUKUS, that's also still evolving, right? So yesterday at CSIS, we hosted IEA Director General Rafael Grossi, and on the record, he said, thus far, the process that the US, the UK, and Australia have been following is, quote, a model of transparency. You take that and juxtapose it to China's lack of transparency, particularly around NPT issues. And so I think there's still very much some competing narratives going on in the NPT about where it'll fall on AUKUS. With that said, seeing the strain that AUKUS is putting on the NPT, I'd be pretty worried about trying to do it a second time around.
Michael?
we haven't discussed the country that's far closer than Korea or Japan to getting nuclear weapons, and that's Iran. And one is what effect Iranian development of a nuclear weapon would have on the region. And I bring it up in this context because every analysis I've read since last week says that China's role as a marriage broker between Saudi Arabia and Iran has vastly diminished the likelihood or the possibility for the U.S. and Israel to take action against Iran should they do so.
Kind of sounds like my question, because I do Iran day in and day out.
Well, I was thinking of you when I asked.
I don't think China's stage managing this rapprochement has any impact on Israeli ability or willingness to take military action to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Because China isn't going to be, attacked, and China doesn't have military assets to bring to bear on these issues. They have commercial assets, and that's what gave them leverage with Iran. I think if Iran did get nuclear weapons, this wasn't your question, but the impact on Northeast Asia, it provides an incremental motivation possibly, or excuse for other countries to think about moving out of the NPT. Everybody would watch how, if South Korea, broke out of the NPT, I'm sorry, if Iran breaks out of the NPT and gets nuclear weapons, maybe South Korea would be slightly more interested in doing so, but only very, very slightly, because they have their own totally domestic reasons for doing so. We have to end in a couple minutes here. Before we end, I just have one last question for both Heather and Caroline, and it has to do with timelines. You talked, Heather, about kind of discrete scenarios of latent and latent capability and hedging and nuclear weapons, but of course it's all one continuum. And similarly, Caroline, you kind of talked about you can't return to the status quo ante, but what's the status quo ante if there's this continuum? It kind of depends on where we are along this. Maybe each of you maybe address that continuum issue?
You go first.
For me, the status quo ante is a situation where the tools of the nuclear tools of the alliance are mostly mostly in the U.S.'s job jar, and so I don't think in a situation where the rock has proliferated, that returning to or that maintaining that would be useful to reversing the decision. I think this is an area where, and I think that the generalized phenomena here is that you have an alliance where the ally is seeking to take on a broader role, and the U.S. is going to have to start to work with that more in the burden sharing department. Not necessarily nuclear burden sharing, but just extended deterrence at large. It's always been Ally 1 does something, Ally 2 does something, and then they work together to do something. So far, it's mostly been in the U.S. when it comes to nuclear tools of deterrence. I think spreading those tools around might be more advantageous in this situation.
Okay, thanks.
In terms of I think of the NPT context and a continuum, I think it's really going to depend on how the nuclear regime, responds to three different evolving trends, which are all at odds with each other, which is going to make it really, really hard. But the first is how the regime responds to what's looking like Iran's further enrichment activities, but also other bad behavior. Does Russia just get to suspend involvement in New START and suffer zero political consequences? That doesn't say a lot about the strength of the regime. At the same time, it's a question of how can the regime adapt to increasing great power competition? How can it remain flexible to that? And then I think the third pressure is all three of these are going to happen before the next review conference. These are all things that the regime's going to have to kind of evolve with. And the third one is how the regime will respond to growing pressure for nuclear disarmament. And it feels strange to talk about that pressure at a time of an ongoing war in Ukraine that is backed up by nuclear threats and when nuclear risks are rising, but disarmament pressure is also rising in tandem with that. And so kind of my final point on all of this is that that continuum of how those things evolve and how the regime responds to it, the U.S. and South Korea as allies can play a really important and influential role in shaping that. And it's just really important that they are in total lockstep on how they want the nuclear order and the nuclear regime to evolve over time.
Great. We end on a very positive, forward-looking notion there. Please join me in thanking great panelists. And then Clint has something to say.
Just very quickly, it's been a long day, and I really want to thank everybody for sitting through all of it, both here and then online. I had high hopes for this conference beforehand, and I really have to honestly say they've been far exceeded. I learned a great deal from reading and editing your papers, and even more from listening to you share in the panels. Particular apologies to those who I asked, especially on this panel, and I think Boram as well, to try to tease out potentialities, right? When it's so difficult to do so, it's speculative. But I think you all did a fantastic job of, it wasn't speculative at all, it was really deliberate teasing out based on where we are, despite all the imponderables involved. And the last thing I'll say is, this was not meant to be a sort of, here are direct policy recommendations, marching orders for policymakers. This was meant to foster deeper understanding so as to help support policymakers in their efforts in a very difficult environment. And I think we've absolutely achieved that, even though we've probably raised many more questions than we maybe answered. But this has been wonderful, and I want to thank KEI for its support in this, and everybody for their involvement as well. So thank you once again.
Thank you.